Good evening, I'm Dr. Henry Bishop-Wright, and I'm very pleased to present this paper, What About Meroë, Roman Glassware and Gaming Across Egypt's Southern Frontier, tonight to the Roman Finds group. It offers a general introduction to the Kingdom of Meroë before discussing a selection of glassware from a Meroitic cemetery that was the subject of my doctoral thesis. It does bear some similarity to a paper that I gave at the Lisbon Glass Conference back in September, but in an attempt not to repeat myself too much, I've chosen to focus here more on how glass vessels were used in funerary ritual, and by considering some rather good mille-feuille glass counters, say a few words on gaming. I hope that the initial section of this paper will orientate any members of the RFG who may not be familiar with the archaeology of Sudan. Octavian's defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE resulted in Ptolemaic Egypt, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms, falling under the power of Rome. By 30 BCE, Octavian had entered Alexandria and begun to dismantle the vestiges of Ptolemaic rule. This included the installation of a Roman governor, one Cornelius Gallus, whose first task was to quell an Upper Egyptian revolt and solidify the southern frontier. In a triumphal inscription set up at Aswan, Gallus claims to have achieved this by installing a pro-Roman tyrant over the 300-kilometer stretch of the Nile between the first and second cataracts and subduing the people of Kush. Kush is a general geographic area approximately synonymous with Sudan north of Khartoum and Egypt south of Aswan. Between around 300 BCE and 350 CE, this land was occupied by the Kingdom of Meroë, which takes its name from its foremost city, the ruins of which can still be found some 200 kilometers north of the modern capital, Khartoum. This kingdom was first the independent southern neighbor of Ptolemaic Egypt and later of Roman Egypt. Its heartland was in the south, a region known as the Butana, but from the early 2nd century BCE, it was also active in the northernmost area of Lower Nubia. It was this northern region that first came into contact with Rome. Cornelius Gallus's intervention sparked a short-lived Romano-Meroitic war that lasted through the 20s BCE and involved a Meroitic raid on Aswan that, according to Strabo, resulted in the destruction of public monuments and was probably connected to the well-known bronze head of Augustus found at Meroë Royal City. This period of conflict was resolved in 21 BCE with a peace treaty that transformed Lower Nubia into a frontier zone between Kush and Egypt. The limit of Roman control was organized at Maharaka, and the area south of this was, at least nominally, Meroitic. Under this arrangement, both powers had a stake in the region's administration, and it became a vital commercial corridor that facilitated sustained material, political, religious, and social interaction. Lower Nubia is now completely covered by the waters of Lake Aswan, but throughout the 20th century, it was subject to 3 major archaeological surveys that uncovered a wealth of Meroitic sites. Most of these sites were cemeteries, the largest of which was situated at Pharas in the Meroitic half of the territory, some 250 kilometers south of Aswan. Pharas is the largest known cemetery of the Meroitic period and was excavated by Francis Griffith between 1910 and 1912 as part of the Oxford excavations in Nubia. Some 2,220 graves were recorded and an astonishing quantity of material, much of it imported from Egypt, was recovered. The full site report, however, was never completed, and all the excavation records were deposited unpublished in the archive of the Oxford Griffith Institute. For my doctoral dissertation, I studied these archived records, produced a new chronology of the site based on ceramic seriation, and examined Pharas's material contacts with Egypt. The chronology demonstrated that the site was in use from the early 3rd century BCE to the late 3rd century CE. Imported objects were available from its earliest foundations, but shortly after Rome's annexation of Egypt, the quantity and variety of imports at Pharas increased dramatically. This object explosion included a limited but still significant quantity of early Roman glassware. I say early Roman with some certainty, as the forms found at Pharas are widely recognizable and there is no conclusive evidence that the Kingdom of Meroë had its own glass industry. According to Griffith's field notes, 60 diagnostic glass vessels were found at Pharas. The most common amongst these was the blown glass ungutarium. These vessels comprised over half the glass corpus, and the majority were of the usual utilitarian bluish-green glass. These piriform or candlestick types are well known from Romano-Egyptian sites and are found across the Roman world. Particularly common was this frustaconical form that probably contained powdered coal used for eye makeup. They appeared in graves as supplementary objects to the ceramic jars and cups that were the typical fodder of Meroitic mortuary custom. Here, for example, we find a rich grave of the mid-2nd to 3rd century, and in addition to a selection of standardized jars and cups that are emblematic of the period, you'll notice a well-preserved glass ungutarium now held in the New York Met. This grave also contained a bronze swing handle and fragments of heavily weathered glass. This is significant as bronze handles exactly like this were often paired with another glass vessel type present at Pharas, the aryballus, or as they're sometimes known, the bath bottle. Aryballoi were less frequent than ungutaria and restricted to the mid-2nd or 3rd century assemblages. This example from Pharas, now held in the Oxford Ashmolean, is heavily weathered, but was originally of green-tinted glass decorated with cut circles and facets. The thick handles of the vessel were attached separately and pierced to accommodate a metal ring. The rusted remains of just such a ring can be observed here. This could then be fastened to a metal swing handle for ease of transport. Vessels very much like this are relatively frequent on Meroitic sites within the Lower Nubian frontier zone and were certainly products of Romano-Egyptian glass houses. Whilst no example from a Meroitic context has had its contents analysed, it is very likely that they were imported as containers for perfumed oil. Another utilitarian form found at Pharas, not quite as common as the ungutaria or aryballoi, was the square-bodied flagon. Examples follow the typical form common not just in Egypt, but across the Roman world. They're of bluish-green glass, and two have base stamps that correspond quite closely to published examples from France. It is therefore worth entertaining the idea that they may have originated in Europe and arrived at Pharas as products of long-distance exchange. Another of the glass flagons is also exceptional, not for its base stamp, but for its size. Reaching 52 centimeters in height, this example is extraordinarily large. In fact, I would hazard that it is one of the tallest square-bodied flagons known to Roman glass studies. Again, it is bluish-green and, like the other examples, would have been blown into a multi-part mold with the handle attached secondarily. It was found in a mid-2nd to 3rd century CE grave where it complemented the usual Meroitic-made ceramic jars and cups. These three forms, the ungutaria, aryballoi, and flagons, comprise the majority of the Pharas glassware, but there were also some less utilitarian surprises. Foremost amongst these were two beakers corresponding to a well-known form found throughout the Roman world. They were mold-blown to produce their characteristic almond-shaped bosses and a diagnostic of the mid-late 1st century CE. The first is reconstructed from heavily weathered fragments of dark glass, and the second consists of a single fragment of weathered cobalt blue glass. These are the only examples of their type from Kush. Indeed, the reconstructed beaker is the best preserved specimen from the entire Nile Valley. Beyond Egypt, the form, often referred to as an almond beaker, is well documented in the wider Mediterranean, and it is likely that these examples were not Egyptian products. Instead, it seems that they were imported to Pharas, perhaps from the Eastern Mediterranean, as luxury drinking vessels. With the exception of a few fragmentary or uncertain forms, these beakers complete the Pharas glass corpus. It has to be admitted that as a collection, the Pharas material is neither the best preserved nor the most visually appealing set of early Roman glassware. Furthermore, Pharas is not unique in Meroitic Kush for yielding glass. Similar forms have been recorded in modest quantities from sites across Sudan. Indeed, some vessels for Meroitic contexts are of significantly higher quality than anything we've seen here today. The value of the Pharos material is not in the presentation of individual vessels. Instead, it is in the assessment of how these imported forms functioned within the wider context of Meroitic mortuary practice. According to the chronology that I put forward in my PhD thesis, the cemetery of Pharos had about 5.5 centuries of continuous use. Significant material change was evident during this time, but the basic constituents of assemblages remained static. Excluding a small number of very early graves, most assemblages contained some form of jar used to store liquid and some form of cup to consume it. This focus on drinking was emphasized by the conspicuous absence of any flat or shallow vessels associated with the consumption or display of solid food. This, it seems, was never a significant part of funerary ritual at Pharos. Other drink-related objects, such as imported jugs and amphorae, were relatively frequent, and cosmetic items like bronze mirrors or wooden coal tubes were also utilized. But the combination of jar and cup was absolutely fundamental and lasted throughout the cemetery's use life. The mortuary tradition was, therefore, extremely conservative, and despite centuries of contact with Ptolemaic Roman Egypt and proximity to the Roman frontier, there was very little evidence to support meaningful Hellenization or Romanization. This conclusion was challenged when I looked at the glassware. Vessel glass was unknown at Pharos until the mid-1st century CE, and the sudden appearance of this alien and extremely exotic material could suggest a change in behavior that some might interpret as the slow rumblings of Romanization. However, if the types of glass vessel present at Pharos are considered from a functional perspective, it is clear that the narrow range of forms were selected according to their ability to be redeployed in pre-existing Meroitic funerary custom. What we find at Pharos are various types of utilitarian container that would have been imported as receptacles for scented oils, coal, or in the case of the large flagon, perhaps wine. These products were already available prior to the appearance of vessel glass and were established in Meroitic funerary custom. Oils were used to embalm and sanitize the body before its placement in the grave. Wine functioned within the pre-existing focus on drinking and offered an alternative to locally brewed barley beer. And thicker-walled unguentaria that probably contained coal simply replaced the wooden tubes familiar at Pharos from the early 3rd century BCE. The glass vessels that contained these commodities functioned as exotic alternatives to the ceramic or wooden vessels that were already accepted within mortuary practice. Meanwhile, reflecting the broader trend in the ceramic repertoire, glass vessels associated with solid food, such as dishes, shallow bowls, or plates, were entirely absent. This is not because they were unavailable. It is because they could not be utilized in assemblages without necessitating a change in behavior. Thus, they found no utility within the staunchly conservative funerary ritual at Meroitic Pharos. The conclusion that mortuary practice at Pharos evidenced a remarkable resistance to change does not, however, mean that some imports hinting at the adoption of foreign practice outside of the mortuary sphere were not recovered. A prime example of this is a set of Millefiori glass gaming pieces and 2 ivory dice found together in the shaft of grave 2581. There are 15 counters, each about 2 centimeters in diameter. 13 are green and yellow as pictured, and 2, now lost, were white and yellow. The dice are cuboid, and despite their condition, were clearly well made, with precise sides measuring between 12 and 14 millimeters. Each side is numbered 1 to 6 with engraved rings that were either dyed with black pigment or perhaps inlaid with some black substance that has degraded over time. Clearly, these pieces constitute an important find and were probably objects of some prestige to their Meroitic owner. But what is most significant is their number. 15 is the accepted number of pieces per side for the Roman game of Alea, which is a variant of duodecim scripta, much like today's backgammon. What seems to have been found at Pharos, therefore, is a complete set of counters for a Roman board game, which suggests that interaction on the Romano-Meroitic frontier extended beyond trade and penetrated social practice. Considering that there was a significant Roman military presence on this frontier, it is quite conceivable that a Meroitic individual traveled to Aswan or one of the Roman period temples in the northern half of Lower Nubia, perhaps on pilgrimage or for commerce, and acquired a taste for Roman gaming before returning to Pharas and eventually being buried with his set of gaming pieces in the cemetery. It is, of course, a bit of a leap to assume that the Meroitic individual buried with this gaming set knew its purpose and knew how to play Alia. Indeed, were this the only evidence of Roman gaming in Kush, the find might be written off as an imperfectly understood foreign curio placed in a grave as a general prestige object. However, these counters and dice are not the only evidence for Roman gaming in Meroitic Kush. Further south, at a site called Sedinga, sets of wood, ivory, and monochrome glass counters were recovered from high-status burials in conjunction with cubic ivory dice and the remains of an inlaid game board. Several papers on these finds have been produced, and their commentators conclude that these pieces represent the most southerly evidence for the Roman game of duodecim scripta. Elsewhere in Meroitic Kush, possible gaming boards inscribed as graffiti have been recorded at Khazar-Ibrim in the north and Musawawat in the south, and it is likely that the northern Meroitic kingdom at least knew and participated in Roman gaming. Returning to Pharas, this hypothesis is instructive as, in addition to the grave containing the Millefiori glass counters, 6 other graves contained what Griffith described as convex glass dumps or glass gaming men. Unfortunately, it has proved impossible to examine or even locate these objects, but it seems likely that at least some of them were counters intended for a game such as Alia. This serves as a reminder that interaction with Ptolemaic Roman Egypt included the spread of knowledge and was not just restricted to objects. Reflecting on this, it is possible that foreign practices like Roman gaming were widespread in everyday life at Pharas, but did not penetrate the mortuary sphere. This is not something that I was able to investigate during my PhD, as the Meroitic settlement of Pharas escaped excavation and now lies at the bottom of Lake Aswan. Nevertheless, Pharas's proximity to the frontier and the opportunities that this presented for social, political, and commercial interaction with Roman Egypt probably resulted in a higher degree of cultural exchange than is perceivable in the staunchly conservative funerary practice. Thank you very much for listening. I do hope that was of some interest, and thank you to Stephen Greep for inviting me to give this paper, and to the organizers of the seminar. I hope to be there on the night to answer any questions. Thanks very much for listening.